encouraging title of Save the Bumblebee and Skerries, and it's a pleasure to see you all. And it's a particular pleasure to welcome our guest speaker, Dave Goulson. Fantastic to have you. Charlie will say a bit more about you before you then say a lot more about berries, beans and other things. And that's where the pleasure ends for me for the minute, because something that was not a pleasure at all was listening to the news today. You too may have heard Charlie Bird talking about the recent report by the World Meteorological Organization about the worsening situation as far as climate change is concerned. There are already more droughts, more flooding, more storms. There are other worrying trends apart from the changing climate as well, more pressure on agricultural production for various reasons, more intense agriculture, less and less space for nature, and faced so as we are with the twin horrors of biodiversity loss and climate change, we all need to find ways of making a difference. We of Sustainable Skerries try to do our bit. How exactly, you can see on our website, sustainableskerries.com, and we'd love for other people to join us in our endeavors. One of the areas that we're working on is biodiversity, and tonight is part of our biodiversity action plan. Luckily, this is where it ends for me, because Charlie is the team leader of the biodiversity action group, and he's going to take it from here.
Okay, thank you, Sabine. Yeah, as Sabine said, we have a biodiversity excuse me, action plan for skerries centered on bumblebees, pollinators, and one particular bumblebee which is becoming increasingly rare throughout its entire range, the large or moss bee. So that's the main focus of our aims, I guess. So we're currently implementing this plan, and that includes both on-the-ground actions like getting more pollen and nectar back into the ecosystem, if you like, protection of habitat and establishment of biodiversity corridors. So we're doing that. But the other side of things is raising public awareness, information dissemination, information sharing, and that's exactly why we're all here tonight. So, at this point, I ought to say our plan is being funded by the Community Foundation for Ireland, so they're paying for the bulk of this here tonight, so a big shout out to those guys. So we decided, excuse me, we decided to have this webinar, and we decided to aim high and get the best speaker we possibly could. No harm in trying, and by golly, it worked. I'm delighted to say, as Celine just said, that we have Professor Dave Goulson here from across the water in the University of Sussex, where he specialises in bee ecology. And I think it's no exaggeration to say that he's actually the UK's leading bee expert, so it's a pleasure. It would take far too long to list all Dave's achievements. If I were to do so, there wouldn't be any time left for him to speak, which would be ridiculous, of course. Suffice to say, he's written over 300 academic papers, but then he turned around and realised that these things tend to get read once or twice by peer-reviewed and chucked onto a dusty shelf where no one sees them ever again. So he decided to write books on the subject aimed at the likes of you or me, which have been hugely successful. And in fact, I have here, yeah,
upside down.
Upside down? No, it's not, it's inside out. Silent Earth, Dave's latest book. Depressing, inspiring, really interesting all at the same time. I really recommend it. You can buy it online, widely available. But as Dave himself says, please avoid Amazon. Yeah, he's been conferred with more honours than you or I could shake a stick at. But many people would best know him, I think, for setting up the UK Bumblebee Conservation Trust in 2006. This is a charity that's grown to over 12,000 members and does sterling work in bee conservation over there. If we could just emulate some of it here, we'd be delighted. So, well, as they say, enough for me, and I welcome Dave Goulson.
Thanks, Charlie. Thanks for the introduction. If I break into a fit of coughing in the middle, I should warn you all, I've got the tail end of COVID. I went down with it a few days ago and I was feeling absolutely terrible a couple of days back, but I'm on the mend, I hope. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about insects, which is kind of my specialist subject, I guess. So first of all, let me share my screen with you, and hope that works smoothly. It usually does. Marvelous. Hopefully you can all see a lovely big fat bumblebee, not the moss carder, the common carder actually. It's more widespread cousin. So insects, they make up the bulk of life on Earth. They are everywhere on land, filling all sorts of niches, incredibly diverse creatures, and it's hard to know where to start talking about them. To give a kind of introduction, and it's surprising actually how little most people really know about most insects. I thought I'd start right at the beginning with where insects came from or when they first appeared. So insects are pretty much the oldest land animals that we know of. Their ancestors crawled out of the sea about 480 million years ago, which is by any standards a really, really long time. It's kind of unimaginable actually. It doesn't mean anything to most of us, but that's way before there were any dinosaurs or anything like that. Insects were really the first creatures to make a success of life on land on planet Earth. They were the first creatures probably to make noises, to sing, to chirp, to buzz. They were certainly the first creatures to take to the air, to fly on planet Earth. And the oxygen concentrations back then were higher than they are today. So that enabled insects to grow bigger than they do today. And there were, back in the day, there were dragonfly-like insects with wingspans of about 80 centimeters, which is pretty impressive. They must have been awesome beasts. Sadly, they no longer can be found. But plenty of other insects can. Insects, as I say, have basically dominated life on land since it began. And even to this day, they are arguably the dominant life force on our planet. They certainly make up most species, about 2/3 of all known species of organism. And in terms of numbers of individuals, I mean, ants alone outnumber people about 1,000,000 to 1, which is pause for thought. So we are living kind of on the planet of the insects. They're incredibly diverse and beautiful, come in all sorts of weird shapes and colors and sizes and so on. They're a random selection from quite a few of those are from close to home, some of them a bit further away. So I thought I'd start off by just something very gentle, showing you some pictures of some interesting insects, just to illustrate how amazingly diverse they are before we get on to the more serious stuff. And I perhaps should have warned you at the beginning that the middle of the talk is a bit depressing, but the end is intended not to be. So you'll have to let me know whether that works. So anyway, let's just look at a few insects. This the endearing little chap is an acorn weevil. We find them in the UK. I guess you probably have them in Ireland, but I don't know. Fairly widespread, very charming creatures, I think, weevils. Actually, weevils are a type of beetle, and beetles are the most successful group of organisms measured by numbers of species. In fact, just weevils alone, there are no less than 97,000 different species of weevil on our planet. Isn't that kind of mind-boggling? All of them with these snouts, down-curved snouts of different lengths. There's a lovely quote from, there was an English evolutionary biologist, a guy called JBS Haldane, who is long dead now, but sometime in the 20th century, he was interviewed and asked in the interview what his studies of evolution had taught him about the nature of God. And Haldane was an atheist, actually. So his reply was probably slightly sarcastic, but he said he must have an inordinate fondness for beetles, recognizing that if God did create them, he spent a lot of time doing it. Anyway, there are many other weird and wonderful insects. I could have put in thousands. There are beautifully camouflaged insects such as this bush cricket. There are insects that mimic flowers. This case it's a rather gorgeous mantis, an orchid mantis, which attracts its prey. Pollinators come thinking this is some sort of exotic flower and find themselves ending up as lunch. There are many brightly colored insects, and often the bright colors indicate that the insect's poisonous. It's a defense against being eaten. They sequester toxins as they grow. And a familiar example might be the Cinnabar Moth caterpillar on the right there, which is a common European species, which makes itself poisonous by eating the toxins in ragwort and then advertises that it's poisonous with the stripes. This insect, on the other hand, isn't poisonous, but it's got a similar color pattern, yellow and black and white stripes, warning that it's dangerous. It's actually a bee mimicking hoverfly. It's completely harmless. It's neither poisonous nor got a sting, but it's pretending to be a bee because that gives it some protection from predators who'd rather not get stung. Very handsome insects. Some insects are just plain weird, and we have no idea why they look like how they look. This is a leafhopper from Central America, which exudes little strands of coloured wax from its bottom. Look a bit like optic fibres. It's a very interesting and weird creature, and nobody's yet worked out what purpose this serves. It must do something useful. It's must be quite a burden walking around with that lot stuck to your bum. Anyway, one more. There's even a shield bug from Thailand, which is said to resemble Elvis. You have to kind of squint your eyes a little bit. But anyway, they are, as I said, incredibly diverse and fascinating. And one could happily spend many lifetimes studying insects, and you wouldn't begin to scratch the surface of what there is to find out about them. In fact, I mean, the large majority of insect species have yet to be discovered. We find new ones all the time. We've named 1.1 million species of insect. But it's been very roughly estimated that there may be another 4 or 5 million that we've yet to give a name to. Who knows what weird creatures are out there. Now, my speciality, as you probably know, are bees. I've been studying bees now for about 30 years. And this is one of the earliest bees. Bees arrived relatively late to the insect party. So if you remember, the first insects were 480 million years ago. Well, the first bees were a mere 120 million years ago, which is still quite a while. It's still before, for example, Tyrannosaurus rex existed. But not so long compared to many other insects. Bees evolved from wasps. They're essentially kind of vegan wasps. The ancestor of the bees was a wasp. Probably was a predator that collected paralyzed prey, might have been spiders or caterpillars or something, and stuffed them into a burrow in the ground and laid its eggs on them. And there are still plenty of spiders that do that to this day. But one of them started using pollen instead of paralyzed prey as the food for its offspring, and that was the first bee. And that has clearly proved to be a pretty successful strategy, and it diversified, it speciated, and today there are about 25,000 species of bee in the world that we know of. And again, new ones no doubt are waiting to be discovered, and they are also wonderfully diverse and colourful. There's some really beautiful bees in the world. Many of these, sadly, the really spectacular ones, I'm afraid, are from the tropics, as you might guess, or Australia. bottom left there is one of my favorites. I've never seen it, and one day I hope I get the chance, but you've got to go to China to see that. It's a blue carpenter bee, a rather large bee, and it's this vivid kind of cobalt blue, amazing creature. Anyway, let me rewind a tiny bit. So I got into insects when I was young, only 5 or 6 years old, and I have no real idea why, other than that I think lots of kids, given half a chance, go through a kind of bug phase. They are fascinated. Take a bunch of primary school kids out and catch beetles and things, and they love it. They scream with excitement. They're not frightened. They hold them in their hand. They want to know more about them. And I was like that, and I never grew out of it. But sadly, I think most people do. This I should explain, by the way. This is my my youngest son, Seth, with his pet cockchafer, Colin, a couple of years ago. Sadly, Colin's no longer with us, but anyway, Seth is still very much in his bug phase, and I really hope he hangs on to that. But as I say, most people it seems that by the time they're teenagers or adults, they view insects with fear and loathing and disgust, and their reaction to anything that buzzes near them is usually to try and kill it, to swat it, as they think it's going to bite them, sting them, give them a disease, do something. I'm sure they're not really clear about what. And that's really sad. I hope you all agree. So my, I guess, mission in life, if you like, is to try and persuade people to love insects, or if that's perhaps a bit too far for some people, to at least respect insects, because they're incredibly important. We need them, love them or loathe them, and people ought to recognize that. And what's more, as I'll explain in a second, insects are in trouble. They're in decline, and that really ought to be a worry to us. Now, I should say, I'm going to talk a little bit about insect declines. This is a little bit depressing. A key point to get across, I think, is that actually, for most insects, we don't have any data. There are huge knowledge gaps, particularly for the tropics, for example, where we have no long-term insect data at all from Africa, South America, or Southeast Asia, which is pretty terrifying because that's where most insects actually live. We do have good data sets for certain groups of insects, mainly from Europe and North America, and mainly the more charismatic, easily identified insects. And sadly, almost all of the long-term data we do have suggests that these insects are in decline at varying speeds. So in the UK, we have a long-running butterfly monitoring scheme, which has been running since 1976. And here, the UK species have been divided into the sort of common ones, the ones you might turn up in a garden at the top, and the specialist ones that you'd be very lucky to find in your garden at the bottom. And you can see they're both declined. 46%, 77% of the figures for the two groups. Overall, British butterflies have roughly halved in abundance since 1976. Now, I mentioned my son is 11. By coincidence, in 1976, that's when I was 11. So that means that the world I grew up in 1976 had twice as many butterflies. I encountered twice as many butterflies in my day-to-day life as my son does today. And I guess the concern is, you know, what will the future hold? What will his children encounter? Okay, so we have data for butterflies. One of the biggest data sets on insect declines comes from Germany, which is based on malaise trapping. Now that's a malaise trap, top right there, that funny looking tent-like structure. Now keen German entomologists, insect enthusiasts, have been putting these malaise traps on German nature reserves since 1989, all over sites all over Germany. This chart shows you the weight of insects caught per trap per day between 1989 and 2016. And it's a bit messy, but I'm sure you can all see there's a general fall from left to right. In fact, on average, the catch of insects, the weight of insects caught per trap per day fell by 76%. So seemingly 3/4 of the insects disappeared from Germany in just 26 years, which is pretty terrifying. And actually, this study was published in 2017, and it did get a lot of newspaper coverage, radio coverage. I was one of the authors, although I can take very little credit for the work. It was all done by these fanatically enthusiastic Germans, but they brought me in to help them write it up. And it actually led to a slightly odd experience about this paper. So as I say, it got a lot of media interest in 2017. And one afternoon, I was in a pub. I'd stopped for lunch on the way to give a talk somewhere, and my mobile phone rang, and it was an Australian radio station, and they wanted me to do a live interview to talk about this new insect decline study from Germany. And I thought, well, I better accept. And so I said, yeah, okay. And they said, well, we'll ring you back in 10 minutes for the live interview. And unfortunately, the pub was really noisy. There was a jukebox playing and lots of people talking. And it was, but then I looked outside and it was raining stare-ons. And I thought, well, I can't, where shall I go? So I went into the men's loo, and waited for the call to come in. And a few minutes later, my phone went again, and it was almost immediately live on air. I don't know how big a show it was. I've no idea how many Australians were listening. And of course, right at that moment, some guy comes in to use the toilet and starts urinating really loudly. And all I could think was that everyone in Australia would think it was me that's urinating. They'd have no idea what was going on. Anyway, none of that's really important. What the reason I'm telling you this is that the first question the Australian interviewer asked me was, I won't do an Australian accent because it would be terrible. He said, so the insects they're disappearing. That's a good thing, isn't it? I think it was probably a sort of tongue-in-cheek, provocative question to get the interview going, but it slightly floored me, along with the toilet situation, and I did think it sort of epitomizes what a lot of people think, actually, that if you tell most people that insects are disappearing, they don't think that sounds like such a bad thing at all. In much the same way, sadly, that there are still people out there that think that climate change means more sunny summers. Anyway, I'm digressing slightly. One more data set. So we have some long-term data sets like the butterfly one and the German data set, but not many. For wild bees, we don't really have any long-term population data yet. The Bumblebee Conservation Trust that was mentioned in the introduction in the UK, and I'm sure very much open to Irish members. When I was part of that, we started a bumblebee counting scheme based actually on the same methods of the butterfly scheme in the UK, people walking transects. And it's been running for 10 years now, but that isn't really long enough, and it isn't really big enough to provide robust data. What we do have for bees and most other insects from some countries, such as the UK, is we have detailed maps showing their distribution and how the distribution has changed over time. And that can be quite revealing as to what's happened. So here's an example closer to my own specialty, the Shrill carder, Bombus sylvarum, which, as you can see, pre-1960 was quite common in the southern half of Britain. I'm afraid Irish records aren't shown on here, and half of Ireland has been chopped off anyway. But it is found in Ireland to this day, but it's not. It's an endangered species in Ireland. Anyway, in the UK, it's over time it has disappeared. By 2000, now it was about 2000 that I got interested specifically in rare bumblebees and why they were declining. And at the time I was based at Southampton University, which I don't know whether you can see my cursor, but anyway, just on the south coast there. And I did some research and I realized that the nearest place where there was a population of the shrill carder to me was there, Salisbury Plain, military training area in the middle of southern England, which is fantastic for wildlife because it's basically been spared the industrialization of agriculture, so the army can have a play at shooting each other. Anyway, so I went there. I spent a summer hunting around on these glorious flower-rich grasslands looking for shrill carders, and I did. It took a long time. I only ever found a few, but I remember getting really excited when I did find the first ones. Anyway, sadly, since 2000, when I found them there, that Salisbury Plain population has gone extinct. So we're now then down to about 5 populations in the UK, but the one on the Somerset Levels there to the west seems to be about to go extinct too. So that'll be then down to 4. This bee is basically, it's disappearing before our eyes. It's this is not a historical decline. It's not something that sort of has stopped happening. It's still happening right now on our watch. And of course, you don't need to be too much of a pessimist to think it's quite likely that this species could go extinct in the UK within a few years. Who knows? Concerning. Okay, so there's a fair bit of evidence that insects are in decline, at least in Europe. And I haven't shown you evidence from North America, but we also have good data for some North American insects. Let me just skip to something else, which might seem a little bit random, but hopefully it'll become clear what the point I'm trying to make. I want to just tell you a little bit about fish, specifically about game fishing off the coast of Florida. So it's a popular holiday pastime in North America to go to Florida on holiday and to pay to go out for a day game fishing. You go out on a boat with big fishing rods that are bolted onto the side of the boat, and you try and catch the biggest fish you can, and you bring them back, and they're killed and they're hung up on display, and the fisherman usually stands proudly next to them, and the fishing company that took you out takes a photo for you to share with your friends and whatever, and they keep the photos as records for themselves. And some of these companies have been running since the 1950s, so they have photographic records of the catch dating back 60 odd years, which is kind of interesting and perhaps predictably. So these photographs were used by some American scientists to quantify how the size of fish caught has changed over time. From the photographs, and you hardly need to do any science to see, top left, back in the 50s, they were catching some pretty whopping fish, sharks and all sorts of things. By 2007 on the right there, clearly the catch had tailed off somewhat. Most of the fish being caught were somewhat pathetic in comparison. That isn't really why I'm telling you about this study, though. It was more because in the discussion of this scientific report, there was a throwaway line that really kind of intrigued me, which was that although the fish have got much smaller over time, the smiles on the faces of the fishermen haven't got any smaller at all. And so look here, there's back in the 50s, that's actually Ernest Hemingway with some big marlin or whatever, swordfish, whatever that is. I'm afraid I'm not a fish expert. And here in the more recent past, a lady with a relatively modest fish that she looks pretty chuffed with, just as happy as Hemingway did. Why is this interesting? Well, of course, the reason she's smiling just as happily, is because she doesn't know what she's missing. If she had any idea that in previous decades she could have expected to catch something enormous like that marlin, then she'd probably be really disappointed with that pathetic little thing. But she doesn't know what she's missing. And of course, the point I'm making is that I think we are all like the smiling lady bottom right there. None of us know what we're missing. We've all grown up in a world that was already somewhat impoverished. The long-term data sets we have for wildlife, not just for insects, but including any type of wildlife, they only date back to the very earliest, the 1960s. We don't have long-term data going back earlier than that. We don't really have any way of quantifying how common wildlife was, let's say, 100 years ago. But we have every reason to believe that declines like the German insect decline, like the UK butterfly decline, didn't start in 1989 or 1976. Those declines are probably, what we've quantified is probably the tail end of a much longer decline, because the things that are driving insect decline that I'll come back to later, they didn't begin in the 70s or 80s. Many of them began, some of them in the 40s, some of them much earlier than that, with the mechanization of farming and so on. Anyway, there are these really tantalizing suggestions that give a hint as to what perhaps things were like in the more distant past. And I just wanted to share a couple of them with a couple of examples with you. So firstly, on the left there, the silverwash fritillary. I don't off the top of my head know if that's a species that occurs in Ireland. It's a relatively rare species found in the south of the UK. I've seen a handful of them in my life, but there's this amazing quote from a guy, butterfly enthusiast, writing in 1880. And he wrote, "The silverwash fritillary was in hordes. They were so common that as the sun touched their overnight resting places, they dropped from the trees like an autumnal shower of falling leaves." And it sounds amazing, doesn't it? There must have been, I don't know, thousands, tens of thousands. I can't imagine seeing fritillary butterflies in that kind of abundance, but unless he just made this up and was perhaps taking too much laudanum or something, presumably insects really were, or some of them at least, much more common in the past than they are today. One other quick example, bottom right there, of course, is cowslips, fairly familiar wildflowers, just been flowering in my garden, just finishing actually now. I've got an old winemaking book from, it's published in 1940. It's for sort of homemade country wines. One of the recipes is for cowslip wine. And the first instruction is fill 2 buckets with the petals of cowslips. Now, I don't know anywhere where that would be even a remotely plausible thing to do. There may be 1 or 2 nature reserves somewhere where you could find enough cowslips to do that, but you'd be deeply unpopular. And yet, clearly, in 1940, that was a perfectly reasonable proposition. Again, suggesting that, that flowers and insects perhaps were orders of magnitude more common in the past, but we just don't know it because none of us have lived long enough to be able to remember. Okay. So one way or another, it seems likely that insects have declined quite a lot. Why does it really matter if insects disappear? As the Australian DJ said, isn't it a good thing? Well, of course, it isn't a good thing. I probably don't need to convince you of this, but I just wanted to run through the reasons why insects are important. It's a useful argument to have ready. So insects make up the bulk of life on Earth. As I've already said, more than 2/3 of all known species. But then they're food for a very large proportion of the non-insect species, things like many species of birds, like these gorgeous bee-eaters, bats, freshwater fish like trout and salmon, amphibians, frogs and so on, lizards. They all eat insects. So if if their prey disappears, then of course they're going to decline in numbers. And we do have clear evidence that insect-eating birds seem to have declined disproportionately over time. Very likely because they've got less to eat than they used to, and there's just not enough insects to support their populations. So again, I'm showing you UK data, I'm afraid. I do apologize, but most of the trends are very similar across the Irish Sea. Cuckoos, sadly, have become a rare sound in lowland Britain in recent decades, but were common birds that used to hear every spring when I was a lad. They're specialist caterpillar eaters, cuckoos, if you didn't know. Cuckoos love big hairy caterpillars. And bottom right there, the spotted flycatcher was a very common, literally a common garden bird when I was a kid growing up. But their populations in the UK down 93% since 1966. Pretty terrifying. So insects are important as food, but they're also important for a whole bunch of other stuff that they do. They are biocontrol agents of pests, things like the ladybirds and hoverflies there. Of course, they're also often the pests themselves, different types of insects. So not all insects are particularly helpful. Their insects are recyclers of all sorts of organic materials, from dung being disposed of by dung beetles and dung flies, dead bodies disposed of by carrion beetles and blowflies and so on. And there are insects that help break down tree trunks, leaves, lots of insects that live in the soil and help to maintain the soil structure and health. There are insects that distribute seeds. You name it, they're busy doing it. And actually, most of this is completely unrecognized by the average human being. They have no idea at all that insects do any of these important things. And it's not glamorous, but without beetles to get rid of cowpats would remain for years. I could tell you an interesting story about what happened in Australia, but I'll spare that perhaps for another time. But anyway, that disposal of cowpats needs to be done by somebody. There is one thing that insects do which is widely recognized by, I think, most people these days, thankfully, and that of course is pollination. Pollination is not, for the record, only done by bees. I'm guessing most of you would know that, but most people don't. In fact, I think many people think all pollination is done by honeybees. They have no idea there are thousands and thousands of species of pollinating insect. There's the 25,000 species of bee, but then there's also butterflies, moths, lots of different species of flies, wasps, beetles, and more besides, all of them busy pollinating. And between them, they ensure that that wild plants produce seeds. They produce the next generation and continue. 87% of all plant species on the planet need pollinating by some kind of animal, not necessarily an insect. In the tropics, that pollination might be done by a hummingbird or a bat. But in Europe, it's all done by insects. So the very large majority of plant species would basically cease to exist if it weren't for pollinators. And of course, there's a clear human link here too. 75% or thereabouts of all the crop types we grow in the world are at least partially dependent on insect pollination, meaning that they wouldn't give a full harvest and without it. Some would produce no harvest at all. So without insect pollinators, our supermarkets wouldn't look so great. We've become used to them replete with this amazing selection of fruits and veg flown in from all over the world, available 12 months of the year. But if we didn't have insect pollinators, then a lot of that stuff just wouldn't be there. Apples, cherries, strawberries, blueberries, raspberries, tomatoes, chili peppers, squashes, pumpkins. I could go on and on and on. Even coffee and chocolate, heaven help us, are both dependent on insect pollinators. So imagine life without them. It would be dire indeed. And of course, the horrible truth is people would starve. Lots of people would starve if we didn't have pollination, insect pollinators helping give us a decent yield. So we have really selfish reasons to look after insects, whether we like them or not. And I've trotted this argument out, I don't know how many times, hundreds and hundreds of times over the years, as to why, you know, the economic argument, the benefit, but it's ultimately, I find it slightly unsatisfying. Firstly, because it's really a very selfish way to justify why we need to look after insects. We're basically looking after them because without them we'd suffer, which seems a bit pathetic. Is that really you know, do we only value other organisms on this planet if they directly benefit us in some way? Surely they deserve to live even if they don't, it seems to me. And it does worry me that politicians might notice at some point that there are creatures that we clearly could do without. They don't do anything particularly useful, and therefore they might think that they're expendable and they can just go. So just let me give you an extreme example. This magnificent creature is the St. Helena giant earwig. It was the biggest earwig that ever lived. It was about 3 inches long. It lived on St. Helena, which is a tiny island in the South Atlantic. It was only ever found there. Hardly anyone saw them when they were alive. They were last recorded alive in the 1960s, if I recall correctly. In fact, these specimens may be the last ones collected. Thought to have been wiped out by, it was just eaten by rats that we accidentally introduced to the island. Anyway, it died out. It went extinct. There was no ecological catastrophe. Nothing else depended on the giant earwig being there. It just quietly went extinct. But it does seem to me the world is a sadder place without it, whether or not any of us were ever going to go and see one. And I think there are many other creatures in the same boat that we haven't yet lost, but that we probably can't justify looking after because they do some vitally important thing. But should they have to? I kind of feel, you know, essentially it's our moral duty as the most powerful creature on the planet these days to look after our fellow travelers on planet Earth. Or put it another way, you know, just because we can make things extinct surely doesn't give us the right to. Anyway, I'm probably labouring the point. You probably understand what I'm coming from. If we're going to fix insect declines, then we need to understand what's driving them. And so I'm going to say a little bit about this topic. It's quite complicated. There are lots of drivers, actually, of insect declines. It's not simple. And I haven't got time to dwell on this at all, and it would be really depressing. But I will say a little bit more about the first two on the list, habitat loss and pesticides. But just bear in mind there are lots of other drivers that I'm not even touching on because we haven't got time tonight. Things like invasive diseases and climate change, and light pollution's an interesting one, and so on and so on. Anyway, loss of habitat. Well, so the biggest driver of habitat loss globally is the transformation of land to farmland from whatever it was before. So this is a picture that I took off the internet. I have no idea where it is, although if I had to guess, I'd say it was somewhere in South America, and that's probably soybean, but I'm not sure. And it really doesn't matter, because my point is this, that if you went back in time, there would have been some sort of natural community living there. Maybe it was a beautiful flowering grassland, or maybe it was scrubland, or maybe it was dense forest. Would have been plants and insects and birds and who knows what else living there. Now, basically, we've scraped that all away. It's completely gone. There's barely a trace of anything left of what used to live there. There's essentially a biodiversity of 1, the crop, or 2 if you count the farmer, and that's pretty much it. Now, you know, of course, we need to feed everybody, and we need to do that somehow. But this kind of industrial scale monoculture farming is having a huge impact on biodiversity, if that's the route we go down. Particularly because it's incredibly dependent upon lots of chemical inputs. You can't really farm like this without using lots of chemicals. I know you don't farm like anything like the scale of this in Ireland, but the principles do still apply on a much smaller scale. So this system of farming is very dependent on inputs. Lots and lots of inputs. The inputs globally go up every year. The amount of fertilizer used has been going up until very recently, when it suddenly got too expensive. Pesticide use globally has gone up and up and up for decades. You may be familiar with Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which she wrote 60 years ago this year, which is a fascinating book that highlighted the harm being done to the environment by pesticides, synthetic pesticides that were introduced in the 1940s. And by 1962, when she wrote her book, it was quite clear that they were doing a lot of harm to the environment. And some of the pesticides she was concerned about have since been banned, but many, many new ones have been introduced. And it's interesting, in her day, in North America, there were 37 types of pesticide available to farmers. Today in North America, there are more than 1,000 pesticides available to farmers in North America, and about 500 to farmers in the European Union. So the problems that she was concerned about have been dwarfed by what's going on today. In the UK, each field on average is sprayed about 17 times each year with different pesticides. Hardly surprising that wildlife doesn't thrive under those circumstances. Though I should say we probably should consider ourselves fairly lucky in Europe, because for the moment in Britain and in the rest of Europe, the pesticide regulatory system is relatively tight, relatively strict, and some of the worst pesticides do get banned. In the rest of the world, it's really a free-for-all. In the Americas and the developing world, it's common to see pesticides being dumped from aeroplanes. All sorts of chemicals are dropped onto the land more or less indiscriminately. In the third world, farmers use pesticides which are banned everywhere else, but are still offloaded to poorly educated farmers who have no training in pesticide use at all. This is a particularly egregious example in my view. If I just explain what you're looking at here, I took this photo myself in Calcutta 3 years ago. This guy he's got a 2-acre farm on the edge of Calcutta, and he grows fruits and vegetables, and he harvests them, puts them in the basket on the front of his bicycle, and cycles them into the market in Calcutta to sell. It actually sounds like a wonderful, sustainable system, selling to local people, no packaging, all the rest of it, except what he's doing. So he's using some ancient spray equipment rigged up to a plastic tank that you can see slung around his shoulder, to spray a herbicide called paraquat. Now, paraquat's been banned in Europe for decades because it's really toxic to people. You'd only have to swallow a drop of it and it would kill him. To be using it before we banned it, we would have recommended that you'd have full protective kit, gloves, breathing mask, obviously some kind of boots. This poor guy's barefoot. The awful thing is, though, that the paraquat he's spraying was probably manufactured in England. So although we banned it for use in Europe, most of the world's paraquat is still manufactured in Huddersfield in northern England, and shipped. Thousands of tons of it are shipped to people like this guy, who doesn't know any better, who's endangering his life every time he uses the stuff. Anyway, just to finish off my rant about pesticides, let me just show you what might on the face of it appear to be a rather complicated chart, but I think it's quite compelling. So this is based on work by some Swiss scientists who asked members of the public going on holiday to buy a jar of honey from wherever they were going and bring it back and donate it to their research project. And each of the little round dots on scattered across the world represents a jar of honey. Now, these scientists were interested in a particular type of insecticide called Neonicotinoids, which became notorious in recent years because of a huge volume of evidence that built up that showed that they were poisoning, harming bees in particular, and generally harming insect populations in Europe. And many of them were banned in 2018 in Europe. They're neurotoxins, they're poisonous to bees and to all insects at really low concentrations. Anyway, they screened the honey samples for these neonicotinoids, and the white ones were clean. The other ones were positive. Now, 75% of the samples of honey collected from around the world were contaminated with neurotoxic insecticides designed to kill insects. That can't be good. It can't be good for honeybees, but it's not just about honeybees, because those honeybees are being contaminated by feeding on contaminated flowers. It's contaminated nectar that they're making the honey from. And if honeybees are being poisoned, then all the other flower visiting insects, the flies, the butterflies, and so on, as well as all the wild bees, are also being poisoned. So basically 3/4 of the world's insects, or pollinating insects at least, are being poisoned right now, which is a pretty scary thought, I think. Okay, so what can we do? Let's be positive and finish on a more cheerful note. The good news is that there is good news, that there is a lot we can do. You know, lots of environmental stories feel really doom and gloom, climate change or whatever. You feel a bit helpless, to say the least. But insects live all around us. Most of them haven't gone extinct yet, and they can recover really quickly if we just give them the right conditions to live in. And it's something we can all get involved in, you know, and see the benefits of it for ourselves in a short period of time. So it's quite empowering in that sense, unlike most other conservation issues I can think of. So what do we need to do? Well, this is just 4 sort of broad areas. I'll start top left. We can turn our urban areas, our gardens, our parks, into havens for insects and other wildlife. I think we also need to think carefully about farming and how we feed the world, and try and find a more sustainable way to do that. One way or another, I'd love to see more flower-rich habitat created. We used to have in Europe staggering areas of hay meadows and flower-rich downlands. Almost all of it was lost in the 20th century. In England, we lost 97% of our flower-rich habitat in the 20th century. I don't know the Irish figure, but pretty terrifying. And particularly from a bumblebee perspective, that was an absolute disaster. The transformation of farming, the abandonment of hay meadows as a way of feeding livestock, and the switch to silage was absolutely catastrophic for many bumblebee species. And we need to reduce pesticide use one way or another. Now, I'm going to say a bit more, go into more depth about what we can do in our gardens. But before I do, Charlie asked me to say a little bit specifically about the moss carder, which I gather is a bit of a local issue to you. Now, there isn't much known about the moss carder, to be honest, not really. There hasn't been a lot of in-depth research done into its ecology and so on. I've done a bit in the past. I have had PhD students studying it, amongst other things. And I've just thrown together a few slides which summarize the knowledge we've gleaned from those studies, which I hope will be in some way slightly helpful. Some of the slides are a bit complicated and not intended for a lay audience, but hopefully I can roughly explain what they're about. The first one is very simple anyway. This is just from a big database of bee flower visits, a list of the flowers that the Moscarda most commonly visits. Now, this is based on sites in including Northern Ireland, but I don't think it includes Southern Ireland. But from what I know, I think the feeding habits are very similar. So it's a bit of an interesting mix, actually, the flowers that they visit. Many of these are classic hay meadow flowers, and that flat lowland flower-rich grassland is a great habitat for Moscarda. So things like the clovers at the bottom and the bird's foot trefoil, the Lotus corniculatus here, they're classics. And in fact, in terms of total numbers of records, red and white clover are stand out the most visited plants by Moscardas. But then there's quite a few other odd things, including some heathland plants, and that's because certainly in the United Kingdom, and I suspect in Ireland too, there seem to be two distinct habitats that you find Moscardas in. You find them in good quality heathland with lots of bell heather, which they really like, and they'll also visit the Kaluna itself. But mainly you find them on the sort of flower, hay meadow kind of flowers, the clovers, the vetches, the trefoils, the yellow rattle, and so on, which explains this slightly odd mix of flowers you're looking at. Okay, so there are a lot of data on what flowers different bumblebee species visit. And I published a paper way back now in 2006, which tried to analyze the feeding preferences of all the UK bumblebee species, which includes all of the Irish bumblebee species. I don't know whether I perhaps shouldn't have included this, but bear with me. Hopefully it'll make a tiny bit of sense. Each species is a little diamond on here somewhere. And all I'm really trying to show is that this analysis that's presented in this chart here clusters species together that have similar feeding preferences, and it separates ones out that feed on very different flowers. So on the left, there's a group of bumblebees. So that's Bombus janellus, the heath bumblebee, and this is Bombus magnus, the large white-tailed bumblebee, or the northern white-tailed bumblebee. And this is the Muscorum, the Moscarda, which clusters in this heathland group, but much more strongly, it's also found over here clustered with the short-haired bumblebee, which is this one here, which is extinct in Britain these days, the brown-banded carder, things like the garden bumblebee and the large garden bumblebee and so on. All the rare bumblebees, the ones that have really declined over recent years, tend to be up here clustered together, and they're all ones that really are specialists in feeding on legumes, particularly for pollen. They seem to be very, very heavily dependent in that 95% or more of the pollen coming back into nests of these species tend to be pollens from Fabaceae, the pea family, vetches and trefoils, basically. So I think if you want to conserve Moscardas, you basically need loads and loads of legumes to take home. And that's why, I mean, this is one of the best places I've ever been for Moscardas. This is on the coast in South Uist in the Outer Hebrides. It's an absolutely beautiful, it's called the maca. It's similar flowers that you'd find in a hay meadow on the mainland, but they absolutely thrive on the thin sandy soils along the coast. Okay, I'll skip the next couple and move on to just finish off by saying a little bit about how we can make our gardens a bit wilder and a bit more inviting to species like the Moscarda. I think wildlife gardening is a really exciting area for two reasons. One is that it's something we can all get involved in, and the other is that it's actually could happen really quickly on a big scale. So I know some figures for the UK. We have about 22 million private gardens, covering an area of about 1 million acres, 400,000 hectares of land. That's a bigger area than all the nature reserves of the UK. And just imagine if most of the gardens were wildlife friendly, and even better if the local council were on board, so that the road verges, the roundabouts, the parks, the cemeteries and so on were also all wildlife friendly. Then that would be a national network of insect friendly habitat, which would make a real difference. And this isn't just a sort of crazy pipe dream. This is already happening. There are lots of people actually already making their gardens wildlife friendly. Rewilding them has become a popular term which some people use, which I think is really fun. And it also, by inviting insects in to live in our gardens, means that future generations are going to grow up being familiar with bumblebees and butterflies and so on. I've written books about it, as you probably know, so I won't plug them any further. Gardens can be incredibly diverse places. So yes, one of the best examples of that is from Leicester in England, a lady called Jenny Owen, who wrote a book called The Wildlife of a Garden, based on her own garden, which is only a little garden, 1/8 of an acre, near the city centre in Leicester. But she spent 35 years counting every species that she could find in her garden, every species of anything, animal, plant, fungi. And after 35 years, her species list was 2,673 different species from her own little garden. I think that's just amazing. And it just shows we could all have thousands of species living all around us if we just invite things in. So how do we make our gardens more inviting? Well, here are a few ideas. Top left, let's be a bit more tolerant of weeds. It's funny how much time many gardeners spend persecuting certain plants in trying to replace them with other plants, on this sort of arbitrary basis that some plants have been designated as weeds and have to go, whereas others are desirable. But many of the plants we persecute so hard are native wildflowers that are really good for insects and for wildlife generally. Things like dandelions and thistles and ragwort and buttercups, they're all beautiful native flowers. And you can get rid of all the weeds in your garden just like that, just by renaming them all wildflowers. Then moving around, top right there, flowering trees. I've got 45 different flowering trees in my garden, but I'm lucky I've got a big garden. But fruit trees, particularly apples, pears and so on, if you plant the right varieties, you can have a continuity of forage right through from March to June. Brilliant for pollinators, and of course, brilliant for providing your own 0 food miles fruit as well. And wouldn't it be great? I think we should plant fruit trees in city parks and in avenues, in streets, so that kids can pick apples on the way to school. Well, why not? Or that seems like a brilliant way of reconnecting people with where food comes from. Then bottom right, an obvious one, lawns. Why do we obsess with mowing all the time? What is it? What is this strange habit we have of trying to create straight lines up and down? Of course, we all know that that's a bit daft. And if we can just restrain ourselves and instead of getting the mower out, get a deck chair out and make ourselves a gin and tonic or a coffee or whatever, and just relax and enjoy the wildlife, it's much more productive. And most lawns will burst into flower if you just give them half a chance. That bottom right there is my own lawn, just a few yards from where I'm sitting. And I never planted any flowers in it. It's just full of stuff. And I just don't cut very often. It's amazing how much life it supports. And likewise, of course, on bottom left there are huge amounts of mown grassland owned by the local authority, road verges and roundabouts and parks and so on. And much of it doesn't need to be mown all the time. The default setting is still often to mow about 8 times a year. What a waste of time and petrol. It seems completely bonkers to me. Whereas it doesn't have to look like that. It could look like this, bottom left. I think that looks fantastic. That's up in Scotland, actually, in Stirling, where there's a little campaign group called On the Verge who dig over any bit of amenity grassland they can get permission to attack and plant wildflowers. And wouldn't it be amazing if everywhere you went, the road verges all looked like that, if every roundabout looked like that? And they've also even sown wildflowers in primary school fields, in next to a rugby pitch, and in the women's prison in Stirling. Has its own wildflower meadow now. How cool is that? Instead, what we sadly see, I don't know whether this happens in Ireland. I really don't. I suspect it probably does. Bear with me if it doesn't. But this sort of thing is a common sight in most of Britain. You look there top right, that's it was a silver birch tree, obviously, with a little square of vegetation around it. It was probably just grass. It wouldn't have supported much in the way of wildlife, but it probably had a few things living in it. Now it's dead. It's been herbicided off by the local authority. Many councils employ teams of people who literally drive around the streets looking for something green to kill and spraying it off with herbicide. I do not understand why anyone thinks that's a good use of resources. It seems completely bonkers, just pointless environmental vandalism to me. But also, aside from the environmental aspect, there is a more sinister side to that, which is that the chemical involved is almost always Roundup, which has the active ingredient glyphosate, which has become notorious around the world because of the growing body of evidence that shows that it's very likely a cause of cancer in humans. This is disputed hotly by the company that manufactures it, of course, and they've done an awful lot to obscure the evidence. But nonetheless, the majority of experts agree that it probably does cause cancer, mainly in the people who use it as part of their occupation. So the very people employed by the council to spray that poor tree are at an increased risk of getting non-Hodgkin's lymphoma as a result. So it seems particularly appalling that we spray this stuff on the play equipment in children's parks, amongst other things. Why on earth would we do that? It just seems completely insane, all for the sake of tidiness. Absolutely bonkers. Personally, I think we should just ban pesticides in urban areas, ban the whole darned lot and be done with it. We don't need them. Whether we need them in farming is a subject for debate. I would argue not, but it's a harder argument to make than the necessity for using them in gardens. You just don't need any of these things in gardens. And if you don't believe me, then we should look at France rather. France introduced a law in 2018, which meant that unless you're a licensed farmer, you cannot buy any pesticide. Which means that gardeners can't buy pesticides and local authorities can't buy pesticides. And Paris is still standing. It hasn't been overrun with killer cockroaches and giant dandelions, as far as I'm aware. Although I must admit I haven't been recently, so perhaps I've missed that. But if Paris can be pesticide free, then why can't Dublin, why can't London, why can't every city be pesticide free? That would be such an easy win for us and for wildlife, it seems to me. Whatever we do, we need to do a better job of looking after this. There really is no planet B. I know it sounds like a cliche, but it's true. This is our home. It is all we have. And if you stop to think about it, it's an amazing thing. It's this rock hurtling through space with a crust of life clinging to its surface, mostly different species of insect and us. It's the most extraordinary thing. It gives us everything. And it's just ridiculous that we're being so careless with our only home. And it really worries me that future generations are going to inherit an impoverished world, and perhaps not even really know, like the smiling lady with the fish, but their lives will be harder because we've used up most of the resources on the planet, you know, and we'd all do anything for our children apart from apparently leave them a decent planet to live on. How crazy is that? So we have to do better, and what better place to start than by looking after all the little insects. Thank you, everybody, for bearing with me.
Thank you so much, Dave, and your cough held out until the very end. That was a fascinating talk, a number of things. I hope the recording's working. I will have to look at it again. And we have had a couple of lots of comments and a couple of questions in the chat. Mariah Lynch, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you, David. Thank you, Sabina. Very direct and very easy. What is the one argument that you will use when we are trying to do biodiversity patches in gardens, and we are against people that want the manicure garden, and they want tidiness, and they want to see everything just a plastic grass almost? So what is the one argument that you will use for us to just repeat and educate and convince and recruit people?
It's tricky, isn't it? I'm not sure the same argument works for everybody, but I think I would start by saying, you know, look, this is a crisis. We are in a biodiversity crisis. Species are going extinct 1,000 times, approximately 1,000 times faster than the natural rate, which means that, I mean, it's estimated that roughly somewhere a species goes extinct roughly every hour. So while you're talking to that person, something somewhere is disappearing, and the chances are it's an insect, because there's more species of insect than anything else. So, you know, while we're arguing, prevaricating, and not actually doing anything, life on Earth is disappearing. And surely, you know, most people, most decent people, if they realize the magnitude of the crisis, would want to play a role in fixing it. But I agree, it's incredibly frustrating. And while it's really exciting to see the number of people, you know, letting their lawns grow long and planting wildflowers and this kind of thing, which is brilliant, you do see also more plastic lawns than ever. And I've even recently seen, I don't know if you've come across this on social media, but there's a move towards non-green plastic lawns. So people laying pink and purple lawns down, which is just I don't know whether to laugh or cry. I really don't. But yeah, that's a whole different. I could recite a long list of reasons why we shouldn't have plastic grass, but I'll spare you that.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. Appreciate them. Very good talks. Thank you.
Thank you.
And if I may jump in myself, Dave, there's so much we can do by winning hearts and minds, and we are trying our best to do that. And then there is also the political arena. You mentioned France introducing that law that pesticides cannot be used anymore, cannot be bought unless you are a farmer. And of course, some of us would argue strongly, and I think you would as well, that from what you said today, that even farmers should probably not be allowed near that. But what are the things, if you could wave a magic wand and the government had to implement 3 things, say, what do you think would make most of a difference?
Oh, crikey, you're putting me on the spot now. Coming up. I mean, to be honest, farming, I didn't talk about farming tonight specifically, other than to point out that it's a major driver of biodiversity loss. I personally think the sort of industrial farming model and the dependence on pesticides is not sustainable. It's wiping out biodiversity, which is undermining its own basis essentially, and it's also damaging soil, contributing to climate change, and so on and so on. And farming covers a much bigger area of land than our gardens. You know, we can do a lot with our gardens, but it's not going to save the planet. It's a nice try, and you know, we should do it absolutely because we can, and it helps. But it's not enough on its own, I don't think. Whereas, you know, I'm sorry for always quoting UK figures. It's where I live, and I know the numbers. 70% of the UK is farmland. So while nearly all of that remains hostile to life, we're not going to get far. So we need to basically come up with a properly sustainable farming system. And you know, there are ways that could be done. There are some wonderful innovative farming systems, things like some types of organic farming, permaculture, biodynamic farming, agroforestry. There's some really interesting stuff being developed. A lot of it pesticide free, which really needs supporting and mainstreaming and subsidizing. And there is this, so I'm giving a really, really long answer here. There is a ready-made mechanism in the CAP, in that we currently subsidize farming a lot in Europe, but we basically pay farmers to be farmers. I don't know the details of the Irish scheme, but again, in the UK, up to the present, basically the bigger the farmer, the more money he gets, and he has to do precious little really to qualify for those payments. If payments were only given to environmentally friendly, sustainable farmers, then it would be a game changer. So if you want a simple way to radically change the landscape, then change the subsidy system, so that I mean, you know, I'm oversimplifying, but if, for example, you said from here on in, you can only get subsidies if you stop using pesticides, that would be a big shock to the system. Yes. And I would suggest you'd want to phase it in, and you'd probably want to make it more subtle and complicated than that. But
there is, of course, for instance, organic farming. Ireland is struggling to come to 3, 4, or 5% of production, whereas Austria is around 25%, I believe. And I mean, the hills are alive with the sounds of insects. Anyway, sorry about that bad pun. Edna, you.
Yeah, I wanted to make a slightly upbeat comment about farming. A number of you may have seen a few programs over the winter about this. Like traditionally, the main agricultural advisor, Teagasc, has just been pushing, you know, fertilizer, you know, monoculture, all of that, and the agricultural colleges haven't been much better. But there's a positive development recently as a result of the increase in fertilizer and diesel prices. And they're now recommending that they change from the kind of monoculture swards of, you know, ryegrass and so on for cattle to much more clover heavy and legume heavy grassland, because the legumes they have microbes on their roots which fix nitrogen from the air in the soil. So if you grow enough clover, you're actually fertilizing your field without actually any agricultural input. Now, that's something that was well known. I mean, it was known traditionally and it was known by organic farmers, but it wasn't being pushed at all by agricultural experts until very recently. And now they're showing how these nitrogen fixing swards save you the cost of diesel spreading the fertilizer and also actually buying the fertilizer. So that's a really, really positive development, and it will mean more clover and other similar swards in the fields. And I could imagine that could catch on very quickly now with the increase in fuel prices. So that's, I think, a bit of really good news, and it's in line with what you're recommending, Dave.
Yeah, it sounds great. It's interesting that, you know, the switch in economics and the simple costs of inputs could be a real game changer. I agree. You know, if we ended up with huge areas of clover, as I mentioned, you know, muscarders in particular, there is nothing they love more than clover. So, and for centuries they survived in meadows where we encouraged clovers because we didn't have synthetic fertilizers in the historic past. They only came in about 1910 or thereabouts. So yeah, that would be great.
Edna, some fantastic insights there, and would love to hear more from that actually. And Claire, you're in Knockline, and you have
yeah, I just have a question. Thanks very much first off for a brilliant presentation altogether. And just Edna's points there about farming, you know, it seems like there's a lot of education going on to try and get farmers on side. And I think some TV programs aimed at kids are getting the very young children on side, if not particularly the curriculum itself, but more so what they're watching on telly. But I worry a lot about actually adults sort of our age, and I just don't think they're getting the message about changing over. Certainly the invested ones are, but I wonder, is there more we can do try and literally get into the heads of adults and people that actually currently own gardens, because they're the people who need to be the ones that put the lawnmowers away and things like that. Because I find in our group, a lot of the time I'm preaching to the converted, or it's a journey where people are starting with, you know, wildflower mixes, and it's a long, I don't know if we have time to let them all get to the point where they're actually putting the lawnmower away and loving their weeds. And I'd just love to know if there's any advice, like billboard campaigns or anything, or how do we get to those adults that have those lawnmowers, etc.
Yeah, this feels like the story of my life, preaching to the converted. You know, I had to break out of that. It's really frustrating. You know, you give talks, and all the people that turn up tend to be like-minded people like yourselves, who agree with most things that you suggest. And if you write a book or whatever you do, it's the same problem. You know, how do you get to the sort of people who would never turn up to this this Zoom meeting? They're too busy. They don't think it's interesting. They don't think it's relevant to them. It's really difficult. And if I had a big red button to solve that one, I would have pressed it long ago. But I guess we chip away at it as quickly and as best we can. You talk to your neighbours, your friends. You know, if each of us can convert one person, and they can each convert a person, it would work eventually. Signage is another way of getting that message over there, particularly when it comes to leaving areas uncut in parks and road verges and so on. You know, avoid them thinking it's laziness on the part of the council or the homeowner. Stick a nice clear sign up saying wildflower meadow. Maybe even put some more information about what interesting creatures might occur there, and perhaps a few people will see that and be inspired to make their own. You know, but it's difficult, and I really don't. If anyone here has a brilliant idea as to how to engage with the uninterested, please shout up, because I would love to hear it.
Sorry, can I come in here then? Yeah, I've been watching the comments in the chat about mowing and all the rest of it, and yeah, I fully agree with what Claire said just there. A lot of people have been given out about Fingal County Council. That's our local council, Dave. Now, in fairness to them, I think they are trying to be more proactive on this thing, on this mowing thing, than people will give them credit for. The council's problem is that, yep, they might agree to leave this verge or that or whatever unmown, and then people come along and make a lot of noise and say, I want that mown, blah, 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 blah. And they who shout loudest win in the end, you know. I think the good news is more and more people are coming around to this way of thinking. And in the meantime, we've got the shout. And it might be a good idea if local councils organise talks, open days, blah, 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 public education. I don't know, but in the meantime, we fight on.
Yeah, and the thing about shouting is a good point, because it is a feature of humans, I think, generally, that we're far more likely to write a letter of complaint than we are to write a letter of congratulations. So usually if a verge is left uncut, or a part of a park is left uncut, people complain. The people that don't like it will bother to write a letter to the council. So the council will get 10 letters saying the park looks awful, it should be cut. They won't get any letters from the people who've enjoyed seeing the flowers, because it doesn't occur to them to write a letter to the council saying, thank you for not cutting the park, it looks beautiful. But if we took the trouble to do that, that would really make a difference, because if there were just as many letters saying, thank you, it looks great, as letters complaining about it, they might not get rid of it. Another thing which has worked elsewhere is taking photographs, and then if there is a lovely area of flowers in a road verge or whatever, keep a record, photograph it, and if the council does cut it, post a before and after on social media. You know, a bit of naming and shaming. It sounds harsh, but it has been very effective in getting councils to change their tune sometimes. But it's all about education, isn't it? You know, bringing them on board and making them realize they can save a lot of money by not mowing all the time, and persuading the public to come with us and not complain about it, and realize it's an active choice and it's a positive one for biodiversity, not just laziness. So yeah, but we're getting there. I think I've really noticed, particularly since the COVID lockdown, lots more councils have reduced mowing regimes and seem to be continuing it, some of them at least.
I think we've noticed that here this spring as well. Yeah. I hope it's not just me and wishful thinking, but yeah, I think so.
I think it's true. Yeah,
I think so
It
too.
is changing slowly.
Yeah.
The council have quite often said already to us that, you know, they would do more. They're introducing interplanting of the daffodils with other pollinator flowers, and hoping that people will be coaxed into tolerating not having the verges mowed all the time by having flowers there in the first place. That's something a county council operative said to me directly, saying, you know, people have to get used to it. We want to go there. At the same time, we still see the yellow spots that tell of Roundup having been used on what I think is council land even this year, after I thought they said last year they wouldn't. So it's an uphill battle, I'd say. I have a question here from somebody, Charlie, if that's okay, who can't unmute, and has an interesting question of a more kind of scientific, I'll bring you back in a minute, of a more scientific area. And Robert Parkinson it is, he says, was the cause of the demise of the shrill carder bee on Salisbury Plain identified? And he says, I find it dispiriting that it could disappear from such an unmolested landscape, the kind perhaps that many of us are trying to create in miniature.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't have an answer. Nobody has worked out why they disappeared. The population was always small. It took me a very long time to find any shrill carders on Salisbury Plain in 2000. And our best guess, and it isn't much more of a guess, is that the shrill carder populations have been suffering from inbreeding. We've done some genetic work which suggests that there's very little genetic variation, and that it's quite a sedentary bee. So the population on Salisbury Plain would have been completely cut off, far too far from any of the other populations for any bees to move between them. So there was no gene flow, and eventually that's can be fatal to populations, because they basically accumulate harmful genetic mutations over time if it's a small isolated population, and it becomes less and less healthy. And this is well recognized in all, you know, in conservation biology generally, but it's one of the few likely insect examples of it. That's possibly why it fizzled out, but we don't know for sure. And I never quite understood why the population wasn't larger to start with, given that Salisbury Plain is a huge area. It's not all as pristine as you might think, but nonetheless, it's pretty special, and I find it disappointing and surprising that it couldn't support a population long term.
So, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Hold on.
Sorry, Sabine, can I just ask Dave a quick question on that?
Yes, Charlie.
Yeah, Dave, something I've often thought about and was dying to ask someone who might know. Yeah, you're talking about small fragmented populations there and inbreeding, worsening the situation and bang this gone. Have you or the Bumblebee Conservation Trust ever tried taking queens or drones from one area and switching them to another, doing a vice versa, trying to or have you an opinion on it?
Yeah, the only thing we've ever done is trying to reintroduce Bombus subterraneus, the short-haired bumblebee, to Kent from Sweden. So we weren't trying to enhance the genetics or whatever. We were literally trying a simple reintroduction there. It didn't work though, sadly. There was a lot of habitat preparation, big areas of what seemed to be good quality flower-rich habitat were created on nature reserves, and a few hundred queens were released over several years. And so far as we know, none of them survived. What you're suggesting of sort of, you know, artificial gene flow, essentially moving a few males or queens every generation to prevent inbreeding, makes a lot of sense. And I think you could make a strong case for doing it, but no one's done it to my knowledge yet. And I think there's maybe one argument against, which is that you might be messing up local adaptation if a particular local population is particularly adapted to the local conditions. By bringing in foreign blood, you might be altering that adaptedness. But also I think conservationists are quite conservative, strangely, and there is a resistance to moving things around, even though scientifically I think it probably makes a lot of sense. But it's sort of seen by some people as too much tinkering. You know, if they can't move by themselves, then, you know, then let nature take its course, which I think is a bit nuts. But there you go.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that. Of course, you're tinkering, you might be tinkering, as you say, and as others might say, but then we've done a great deal of tinkering in the first place, which has caused the situation. So,
well, yes. I mean, the entire landscape is very much tinkered with already, isn't it? And has been for hundreds of years.
So I think we're coming to the end of this evening. You've been very generous with your time, Dave, and I've just put in a very quick survey here, mainly to find out where people are based. It is amazing to see so many people near Skerries and in Skerries. It's always good to have visitors from outside, but what we really need most of all is people in Skerries to get involved and to be more active, to spread the word. We will send you an email with the link to the recording in the hope that this is working. It's the first time we're using Zoom to record and share that afterwards, so it'll take a couple of days to produce. And thank you so much for a lot of insights, a lot of new facts, Dave, a lot of absolutely wonderful and somewhat frightening thoughts. And I had to actually check how big 3 inches is. And for an earwig to think 3 inches, that is pretty big. Being from the continent, I had to convert.
Size of a finger, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So yes, fascinating. Lots of practical tips and also things that I think in Sustainable Skerries and hopefully beyond we'll be tackling, doing, and spreading. Great in these days to find something that is doable and will give us a positive result in a short time. Charlie, thank you very much for suggesting Dave and for getting him to come here. And Dave, thank you very much for being here in Skerries. We hope to see you sometime in real life. It is very much worth a visit. Just, you know, Google Skerries. And everybody's sustainableskerries.com. As soon as you go onto the website, there's a friendly little pop-up box inviting you to join our newsletter. It's a good thing. It's a good pop-up box. Charlie, do you want to see us out there?
Well, all I can say is thank you very much, Dave, for coming. Yeah, we couldn't have had a better speaker. Also, thank you, Sabine, for doing all the organising and the electronic wizardry, which is completely and utterly beyond my ken. And thanks for everyone for coming. And yeah, look, everyone, just keep up the good work.